Jill Purce, I've done many healing the family and ancestor workshops with you, and they've transformed my life in such a profound way that I really wanted to understand a little bit more about where it came from in your life. What got you interested in family constellation work?
I began to do ceremonies for the ancestors, something that I realized was missing from the lives of Westerners, something which I realized was very much still a part of the lives of people from the Far East, from Japan, from China, from Thailand, and so on. There's a realization of the importance of the ancestors in the life of the living. So this goes back to ancient China, where feng shui began. We think of feng shui as things dangling over our bathrooms, little bells in convenient places, but actually it began with where in the landscape in prehistoric China you buried your ancestors, because according to the positioning within the relationship of the ridges of the mountains and the flows of the rivers and the dragons and the tigers and so on of the landscape, this would hugely change the outcome of the well-being and the flourishing and the health and the prosperity of all the generations to come. And this was the origin of feng shui. And so I realized that this awareness of the importance of the ancestors to the living played a huge part in the lives in Eastern cultures, but had actually been eroded completely from Western culture, so that we had become amnesic. We had completely forgotten the importance of invoking the presence of the ancestors. So you find this with pre-literate cultures, you find it with tribal cultures, and you find it with Far Eastern civilizations. But in the West, if you're wealthy, you might have a few portraits of your ancestors, or if you're less wealthy, a few photographs going back a generation or two, if you're lucky. Or in the Christian church, you can still at Samhain or All Saints, All Souls, the Festival of the Dead, co-opted into the Christian church at the beginning of November. You can still, in some churches, put the name of your ancestors into a box and have them say a requiem mass for your ancestors, but very few people know this, and it's not so common. So really, this is something that had died out in the West completely, and I started doing ceremonies many, many years ago for the ancestors, and began to find that members of the family would call up the people who'd been part of it and say, what have you been doing? Things seems to be changing, everything's getting surprising, things are happening, things are improving. And I began to realize that just spending time going back through our ancestral lines and honouring, becoming aware of our ancestors, honouring them, was having a remarkable effect on the life of the living. And so as time progressed, I began to work more and more specifically. And then I started doing kind of ancestral detective work with individuals, going through their family, seeing the relationships between people through different generations, and seeing why people find themselves doing the things they do, because very often people find themselves living out the unfulfilled ambitions of their parents or their grandparents, or people find themselves redeeming things that earlier members of their families have done, even though what it was that the earlier generational members of their families did was, at the time that they did it, very often considered perfectly normal and considered to be the kind of thing that people did, either to make a living, do well, or because it was approved of by society, or because they were rewarded with titles and estates and a position in society, because that was what was considered appropriate at the time. And so people who made good in large ways through doing these kind of things, often without realizing it, caused problems down the generations, where people who had been exploited or suffered in the making of the original fortune or in the colonializing process suffered in the way that earlier people had done in the enacting of whatever it was that was done. And so later generations also found that what they did was in some way some form of redemption or redeeming of the original activity that was done by early generations. And you tend to find this more in families that have made good and made big, because more is known about these people. But there's very often this unconscious redemptive process. So I began to discover all these different trends of relationship between things that people did now, ways that they had of being, which are related to earlier members and what they did and the way they had their being. And so over the years I began to make it more and more specific.
And you say that the sound creates form, and the most important sound there is the voice. Is one of the forms that it creates the actual family field itself, and how does it do that? Because you use chant in your work, whereas most people don't, and in terms of family constellations, it's a particularly good way of forming the family field.
So as I began to develop the way of working with individuals within the group, people choose other people within the group to represent members of their family, their parents and siblings, for example, if they're working with their birth family, or their partners and children if they're working with their current families if they have them. And in some very mysterious way, when people are chosen to represent these other members of other people's families, they tune into those individuals. So this is very different from acting. So they're not chosen to act out an angry father or an angry mother or what they think of as being the nature and personality of the person they're representing. On the contrary, they're chosen in such a way that they let themselves drop away and in some mysterious way tune into, by just opening themselves, emptying themselves with no expectations, into the person that they're chosen to represent. And this is a very mysterious process. So it seems to be that they're tuning into some kind of field. This is the only way I can really describe it. And some kind of resonant field. The only metaphor, if metaphor it is, that can be used to describe this field, and field itself is a kind of metaphor perhaps. So this resonant field of the family ancestors seems to be some kind of a tangible entity, a holistic entity, which by its very nature and by the very nature of fields is a whole. Magnetic fields are wholes, and you can't have bits of a field. It's by its very nature a whole. And so the fundamental nature of this work is to restore the wholeness of the field. And so the work really is about establishing perhaps things that happened in earlier members of the family which were separatistic by nature. So early deaths, suicides, incarcerations, dodgy dealing, injustices, war deaths, deaths in childbirth, giving up children for adoption or being given up for adoption, or anything which causes a separation between members of the family, which normally, by some notion of what a family is, wouldn't exist. Something which casts people who are normally considered to be close apart in a way which is untimely. And so when untimely activities happen of this kind, then there seems to be some kind of a trauma, a pattern of trauma which has a stability, and it has a stability in time, and seems to exist going down through the generations, and different members of subsequent generations who happen to be vulnerable or susceptible, or who resonate with a particular issue, or happen just simply to be there, are in some mysterious way chosen to, or are available to, reflect or embody something of this original trauma. So the trauma goes down through the generations epigenetically. It goes down through some carrier field which we really don't know, which I call the field of the family and ancestors. And that means that later generational members who are susceptible to this, or who in some way follow earlier members out of the system, are at the same time the very people who are able to heal it, both at the same time susceptible to the problems or to being exiled from the field, and at the same time are available to actually heal the separation in some way. And so this field, this of family and ancestors, for want of a better way of describing it, has this tangibility. It seems to be some kind of a resonant structure with a wholeness to it. And so when I'm working, I find that using actual resonance is a way of inducting or activating this resonant field. And it's a very powerful way. When you chant together, when you use voices together, because of the nature of sound, every form has its own sound. You know, if you fill a wine glass and you wind your finger around it, the wine glass will utter a note, different glass, different note. And, you know, if you put water in it, different note again. And so we know that every form has its own sound, and you can use that sound to destroy the wine glass if you have a good voice and a expensive wine glass. So you can sing the sound back at the glass and break it. So we know that you can break glass with sound. You can destroy matter with the sound, which is the sound of the thing itself. So everything has a sound, and it's the sound of the thing which can break the thing of which the sound is. And so when you want to dissolve the separation between people, then the best way of doing that is by chanting together. And it's the way that's happened over generations. If communities have been created through chant, through singing together, through chanting together, you create this very powerful sense of community. And this has been done since time began. So when you're working together in this way of working with the family, you work with a group of people, you choose people from the group to represent your family members, and then the rest of the group is holding the space for healing. The ones who are not actually working in this particular family are present, holding the field together and contributing their energy, if you like, for the healing process by their attention, the healing attention. And so in order to amplify this field, I find, which I think of as a resonant field, I like to use actual resonance, which is this way of dissolving the boundaries between people, which is the way of activating a field. And so I find that it makes the work more powerful.
You are at the centre of this work. You're talking about the group and how you form resonance between them. But at the centre is you guiding these constellations as in a kind of oracular kind of role. Can you talk a bit about the oracle and maybe its place within our society, its lack of a place, or how it works within this constellations?
So I see this whole process as being very oracular. In the 70s, I had a research fellowship with Maurice Wilkins, who was one of the 3 biologists who got the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA. And so until very recently, the notion of inheritance was very much bound materially to the structure of people's DNA. But in the last 20 years or so, there's been a growing movement, which is now extremely powerful in all of the life sciences, which existed in Russia in the sort of 30s and 40s, but was scowled upon, highly scorned by Western biologists, but which is now all the rage, and that's the field of epigenetics. And that is the non-genetic inheritance of acquired characters or characteristics, or in other words, the inheritance of trauma in people, for example, or in mice, the inheritance of fear. One of the more interesting experiments was where mice were exposed to acetone phenone, a scent with a kind of flowery, almondy kind of smell, while at the same time being given electric shocks. And then they were bred in vitro so that the subsequent generations didn't meet their parents. And it was found that subsequent generations of mice, children of the mice and grandchildren of the mice, were terrified of the smell of acetone phenone. So they in some very mysterious way were inheriting the fear associated with the smell. And so this is an example of epigenetics, and there are many, many examples in many of the life sciences now. So that we now know that it's possible to, and not only possible, but is absolutely central to our experience, that we do inherit traumas in a way that we can't explain currently. So this process where I ask people to choose other people to represent their family members, I think of as an oracular process. By these people, once they're chosen to represent these people, and by dropping away any notion of who they might be representing or what that person might say or do, and just emptying themselves and just responding in a way which is utterly mysterious. And then when people have chosen their family, they then set them up into a kind of tableau. So they stand behind them and they shuffle them into a spatial gathering or group or constellation, an order which is to demonstrate the relationship that they feel exists between these people and themselves in a timeless kind of way. And then I tune in with each person, check in with them, and then I work with them and get a sense of what's missing, who's missing. I bring people in, I lie people down, and then constantly responding to the response to what I'm doing and working with it in the moment of revelation. And equally, if I were to have any notion of what might happen if I was to try and impose order on it, if I was to try to control it in any way, or if the participants try to control it in any way, what is very clear that the work stops. So it only works if I respond to what is being revealed in the moment. And if I were to go against that, or to not heed it, or to try and impose some notion of what ought to happen on it, then the work stops. And I liken this to the oracle. If you don't listen to the oracle, they go home. So there's this process of revelation in the moment, which I see as kind of oracular, and which responds to the asking of the question. And the asking of the question is the setting up of the constellation, is the setting up, is somebody coming with some need, some desire to heal something. So it's a kind of intersection with the quality of time, with some question about their state of being, and an invoking of representatives to tune into that moment outside of time, and then responding to what is revealed by my dancing with the group as it reveals what they experience, and in response to my bringing in things that I feel might be helpful or needed in the form of other people, or asking people to say things briefly in relation to very much honouring people who've been dishonoured, bringing back people who've been exiled. It's restoring the coherence of the field. The whole work is about restoring the coherence of the field so that all the people who've been cast out, exiled, or to whom injustices have been done, people who weren't heard, people who weren't seen, people who died young, people who left. So all those outliers, and especially the most unfortunate outliers of all, are sort of brought back into the system so that everybody takes their rightful place and order is restored. And for that reason, it's the most profoundly benign process, because it's a restoration of order, wholeness, and coherence.
And much psychotherapy today focuses around talking and being aware of what you can be aware of, whereas this work seems to go directly into the unconscious, as you've just discussed. How is that achieved in seemingly such a better way than so many other therapies out there at the moment? What the reason why you've chosen it?
So I've worked over the years with many forms of therapy and healing, and I think this is one of the most powerful that I've come across, and partly because it is tapping into much deeper unconscious levels. Most of the patterning, most of the things that we do, that are done to us, that happen to us, that unfold in our families over generations, that our responses to situations and circumstances are unconscious. We react unconsciously to things that happen to us because of patternings of which we have very little awareness or control over. How those are laid down is interpreted differently depending on your particular theory or philosophy. But the fact is that we act mainly reactively according to patternings of our psyche, which are completely unconscious to us. And so talking therapies I find they're very nice. People feel better if they've got it off their chest. Whatever it is they feel, they can access consciously with a nice sort of warm person to talk to, and so on. And I think they're very helpful, but I think they only go so far, because so much of what we do is unconscious, completely unconscious. And so the only way to evoke or bring about or induct any kind of profound healing has to go into much deeper levels of the unconscious to really be effective. That's my experience. And this way of working is that. It works with greater forces, with larger patternings, with transgenerational activities and traumas and patterns and unconscious forces and larger structures of the family. So larger structures of the family, both in time and space. So, for example, we don't exist as isolated beings. We exist within the context of our family, not just our existing family, but our family throughout time. And you really can't extract successfully as a healing modality any part of this without invoking the whole and working with the whole, both in terms of space and time. So this way of working sets it in a vastly larger context, spatially and temporally, so that you see and witness the whole family working, because you're seeing people represent your family members, not just now, but going back generations. So you see the whole working, but you don't only see, but you experience as reactivated and living through this collapse of time of many generations and many people within your family. So you see the relationships between them in a non-temporal, non-spatial way, but in a way which is resonant and effective and causal in ways that we don't understand. So you have this vast perspective that you're participating in, and that everybody else is witnessing and sort of reinforcing by that feedback of astonishment as the revelations happen and the transforming of the feelings. It's very much the workings that I do with the group is very much in response to the feelings that happen and are evoked by different movements and actions and different wordings. So the response and the dance that I do with the group is based on very deep responses that are being evoked as it develops in ways that with ordinary talking therapy just simply doesn't happen.
Many people who would come to this would think, well, I can't represent. Maybe some people who go to these things are the sort that can represent. How on earth does this happen? Usually actors take years to train before they can really actually get inside the character of someone else. How come it's so easy to represent so efficiently?
Well, I do point out when we do this work to people that this is most categorically and definitely not acting. And if you try and act, the work stops. Maybe, we don't know, but maybe acting began by people in some mysterious way tuning into the people that they were representing, which would be a much more effective way of, as it might be called, getting inside the characters of people. So this work is not about acting. It's very mysterious. It's a way of tuning into a character. And one of the ways that I saw this was when somebody chose my son to represent his brother, who was feeling very vulnerable at the time, and my son had never done this before, and I watched him sort of going from his normal cheery self to in a sense almost crumbling to being this other being who was also present and watching and saw my son transforming into him, and as did his brother. And then I saw him gather himself together and say, "Oh no, I'm me, and this can't be happening," and becoming himself again. And then at the same time, again, sort of I could see him physically kind of folding up and becoming this other person, and then again, no, this can't be happening. So I watched him flipping between the experience that he found himself being of becoming this other person who was in a completely different state to him in this particular moment, who was vulnerable and not feeling good, and And then my son coming back to being himself, and I saw him oscillating between the two, as you can only really recognise when you know somebody as well as you do your own child in his mid-20s. And then finally you could see that he got it and relaxed into being that person for the duration of the session. And then when it was over, he came back to being himself, and all, he was totally normal again, dropped off this way of becoming somebody else. So it is a totally mysterious process, and one that we simply, like so much else that happens in this world, we really don't know how it happens, but it does happen, and is extraordinarily powerful and revelatory process, because you're able to watch in this non-spatial, non-temporal time the vast field of your family unfolding, and relationships between people that you would never have dreamed of there being, and also people that you didn't know existed. I mean, this is one of the things that happens sometimes. It becomes clear that there are people in the family field that you think weren't there. Somebody working once, it became very clear to me that her father was devastated by the death of some siblings, and either because he was responsible or because it was survival guilt. And this person said, no, they're all there. His siblings, my aunts and uncles are all there. I've chosen people to represent them. And I said, no, I don't think so. It was very clear to me that this was not so. And so later on, after the group was over, she wrote to an 80-year-old aunt who took about 6 months to reply, saying, yes, we had two other siblings who died aged 2 and 5 of meningitis and diphtheria. So it's oracular in that sense. It reveals things that we don't know and which subsequently are very often proved to be the case. Just as it also affects other members of the family who aren't present in the room. So very often, on many occasions, I have people... On one occasion, I had somebody come back on the second day of a weekend and say, you're not going to believe this, but while we were working yesterday, and my mother, who I'm staying with, she's been estranged from her 6 brothers and sisters for 25 years. They all telephoned her for the first time while we were working. So other members of the family who aren't present and who don't know what's happening and have no idea that the person's working, nevertheless respond to the recoherifying effect of the process in a very benign way. So there's a kind of restoration of the coherence of the field, which is tangible and which affects other people in very benign ways at the same time, even though they don't know anything about what's happening. But one of the things that happens, which is very extraordinary, is when people are chosen to represent other family members, that in itself is an extraordinarily healing process, because, again, in some baffling way that, again, we don't understand, the people they're chosen to be, so as the work is developing, people choose from the group almost randomly people to represent their family member, so you have this intersection of chance. There are all these oracular processes like the I Ching, where you ask a question of time and then you throw some kind of divinatory device, in this case, the I Ching with the coins or the sticks or whatever you do. So there's some kind of intersection through time with some question. It's like divinatory astrology, orrery astrology, where when you begin something, you look at the stars at the beginning of something. So there is this way, traditionally, of intersecting with time with a question and then reading the answer, whether it's in the landscape. Some ancient Greek had this divinatory system whereby you asked a question and you overheard the words of some passing stranger, or you might open a book with a question in mind and read the first sentence. So always through time there's been these way of consulting, of going beyond the logical mind, plummeting into some other dimension to have some kind of reflection on your question. And so when you're chosen to represent, very often the people that you're chosen to represent have some uncanny relevance to your own situation. And so you find that when you're working, say, in the workshop situation, when you're called on to represent in many different constellations, for example, if that's the case, that each time you're chosen, it has some bearing on your own situation, and that in itself is extraordinarily healing. And then sometimes also a particular workshop will have a theme which emerges. So why it is that particular people decide to come together at a certain point in time and space is another mysterious thing. And I've worked with groups over 40 years, and and found that in itself is always very interesting. How people constellate themselves into groups at a certain moment in time and space, and the relationship that they often have together, and how this intersects with what we have come to call coincidence and so forth.
Some of the issues you talked about, these deep, long-held transgenerational issues, are incredibly embedded in a family's field, and it can affect the entire family. I've seen in your work so many times that very, very easily this can be completely changed, almost in sort of half an hour or even 5 minutes. How come it is so easy to change such long-held things when so many other therapies just take forever to do it, or maybe never achieve it?
So I think this, because a lot of these traumas are transgenerational, how is it possible to heal things that have been embedded in the family for so long in a way that other therapies don't? I think it's because the whole nature of this work is transgenerational, is dealing with the larger patterns both in space and time, in terms of dealing with all members of the family who are equally important, as are people in previous generations. So everybody has an equal importance in this work, whether they're long dead, their previous generations, or whether they're not present, or which they usually aren't, and further from the people who are actually present and working. So everybody's equally important, and when anybody's rejected or forgotten or disliked or disowned or dishonoured, this has very difficult consequences for the whole field of the family. And this work is about restoring the most unfortunate and disliked and dishonoured and rejected members of the family, so that they take their rightful place. And because healing of any individual isn't individual healing, it is about healing the whole, because we are part of this much larger structure, energetically and in every possible way. And so any real healing that's going to happen has to take into account multiple generations and multiple members of the family spreading out in space, because our state of health is part of this vaster system, both in space and time. And so because this form of working addresses this and works in the present, if you like, to transform the past and the future, it's unique in its reach and in the addressing of a much greater system, which has to be addressed for real healing to happen. And it's something which is very important for each one of us to do for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, because otherwise these patterns of trauma which are captured in the field go on generation after generation after generation. For example, in suicides happen in families generation after generation, to use an extreme example. But many patterns go on through generations. And unless you work with the whole system, these will continue to go on down the generations. So another reason why this is so powerful is that you're able to deal with it finally, release the traumatic pattern from the field in a way which has a big effect on everybody.
And you've talked about how one of the things you realised was that we'd lost this awareness of the dead in our society, the ancestors, and how they affect us now. Do you see, and obviously in order for our society to become healthy again, we're going to have to embrace this truth. Do you see constellations as the way back, that maybe in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, I don't know, could actually bring us back to this awareness? How do you see this awareness coming back to our society? Is it going to be through constellations?
Well, I think when I first started working in this general area, there was no awareness of the importance of the ancestors in the West at all. It had died out virtually in the church, in the Christian church, and very few people considered it. It was considered, in anthropology as something that other cultures did, and usually primitive ones. When anthropologists used the word primitive, which of course they don't anymore. But traditional societies were seen to be doing this, but it was something that it was thought that the more sophisticated societies had grown out of, because it was something that, when the word primitive was used, would be considered such. And that's changed now. So since I started working, more and more people have become aware of the importance of the ancestors and beginning to work with it. And, of course, it still exists in the Far East, although when I talk to young Japanese people now, I mean, when I spent time in the early 80s in Japan, most people had a family altar, a patriarchal one. It was the family altar of the last male patriarch of the family who just recently died. But nevertheless, it was central to the household. Now, when I talk to young Japanese people, they sometimes say, oh yes, my grandmother had one, but it's not something that's so central. But what is very interesting in the tsunami, where over 20,000 people died in Japan, which was completely devastating. But one of the things that most people didn't realize was that the ancestors were orphaned. So the ancestors, in this cultural view, had no living to take care of. So traditionally, the idea of the ancestors is, in traditional cultures, is to help the living remain alive. This is their job description in most cultures. And ancestors themselves have no agency. They have no ability to help us unless the living make contact with them. So, in other words, you have to be alive to kind of activate the channels of benignity between the ancestors and the living, which is why this has always been done. So ceremonies to honour the ancestors makes it possible for the ancestors to help us. And until that happens, they're a bit like clamorous children and seem to have a rather difficult effect on our lives, a sort of low-grade irritation on our lives, like tripping us up here and there, almost clamouring for our attention, but not able to actually be effective in a benign way, but just rather annoying. But then as soon as we kind of wake up to this, the need to do this, once we start to honour them and to see them and to thank them and become aware of this presence of this field of ancestors in whatever form that means or is, and again, we don't really know what that is, then as soon as we honour them, and but by doing that open up the channels for them to be helpful, only then can they really look kindly on us, help us and assist us and make our lives easier, help us remain living, and all the kind of things that everybody's always ever thought they did. So in Japan, in the tsunami, when so many people died, the ancestors and many of the ancestral shrines were washed into the sea, so they were lost and orphaned because they had no people to help. And some journalists who were in Japan after the tsunami, one in particular, was talking to a priest who had been working with some young living people who would find that they were almost like possessed with certain ancestors who, had nobody to help anymore and needed to be cleared or exorcised of this, of these inhabitations. So it's a very powerful stream of healing in our lives, which we've cut off through thinking it can't happen and it's something so-called primitive and something that we've grown out of. Whereas it's actually setting our healing in a much vaster context in ways that we really don't know what language to use, and can, by talking about the resonant field, we are sort of metaphorizing, we're relating it to things that seem more contemporary, if you like. This always happens, that you tend to borrow terms from modern technology to describe other contemporary technology to describe things, like the computer model of the brain, for example, which of course we know is ridiculous. But we need to borrow these metaphors. So we don't understand. There's so much we don't understand about the way the mind works. We don't understand hypnotism, meditation, trance, any of these things which we know exist, and very powerfully so, but we don't really understand how they work. We don't have the language to understand them, so we borrow metaphors from other things. And so whatever we mean by the help of the ancestors, we don't know what that means. We don't know how it works or what it means. So we have to borrow different terms to make it more appealing, if you like. So rather than thinking of specific people, the idea of working with a field makes it less peculiar to us. So we have to try and make it fit into a larger image of how things might be that we don't yet understand. But the main thing is that it works, it's effective, it's powerful, it's extraordinarily healing, and very quickly so. And very often we have to work with things because we know they work, comparative effectiveness, if you like, even if we don't understand how they work. And the important thing is to be open to working with things that we don't understand when we know that they're effective.
And just finally, how can people in their everyday lives, with this awareness and being open to the ancestors playing a part in the real part in their lives, what kinds of things can they do in their everyday life? Like you mentioned a family altar, or I suppose your ancestry.com.
What's happening at this moment, as well as people working in this way, is that there is an unparalleled interest in people's ancestry, partly because of the web and the Seventh-day Adventist, the Mormon community. There are these websites, ancestry.com or .co.uk, where people can begin to research their ancestors, and then will put their little bit of research up on the web, and then maybe some cousin of theirs puts another bit up, and then another aunt might put up another bit, and they all start interlocking. What's happening in cyberspace is there's this reactivation of the field of the ancestors in terms of identifying the family tree, naming people, giving them dates, sometimes photographs. So there's a kind of activation that's happening in the cybersphere, which has a kind of interesting as above, so below, if you like, correspondence with this kind of work that people are doing as a therapy. And the two are often related. So people who work with me very often will begin to become very interested in actually who their ancestors are, and will do kind of research, and the two feed off each other. I mean, even though you don't need to know anything about anybody really to do this work, strangely and mysteriously, nevertheless, the more information you have, actually the more interesting it can become, and the deeper you can go in terms of relationships and activities and resonances between people and names and so forth, dates, anniversary syndromes, and so on. So there is a very interesting parallel that is happening here, which is affecting the nature of the work. So things that people can actually do to really help. Firstly is to talk to elderly relatives, go and have tea with them, and in a way which is disarming. Don't challenge them. Sometimes when you have family secrets or things that have happened in families which, according to what was considered appropriate in society at the time, very often, if things went against what was considered appropriate at the time, things were kept secret. And then family secrets tend to ooze a kind of toxicity down the generations. And very often old people don't like talking about them, even if they know what they are. And so really helpful thing to do is to talk to elderly relatives so that they don't die with these secrets, and also find out who was who, and begin to find out what people did, and how people died, who died young, and what sort of family traumas, and where people emigrated to, all these kind of things. Talk to elderly relatives, and talk to them in a way which is non-confrontational, so that they're disarmed and not confronted, so that they feel able to talk about these things in a way which isn't a challenge for them. And then sometimes they'll be very glad to talk about it before they die, because otherwise these things die with them. So that's a really important thing to do, and record them if you can too. And then one thing that I did many years ago, having spent time in Japan, was I decided to make a family altar. So I actually have a family altar in my house, and that's a wonderful thing to do. And I sort of activate it occasionally by giving it water and lighting up some candles and just looking at these various people and honouring them. So having a family altar, in my case, not being patriarchal, I have both sides of my family on there, which I think is very important. From time to time I honour them and thank them. We wouldn't be here without all these people and all that they've gone through in their lives, sometimes very hard and arduous, and sacrifices made for their children. And people make extraordinary sacrifices for their children, for the ongoing generations. And so, in a sense, we have a lot to be grateful for. And so gratitude is very important, I think. So honouring and being grateful to ancestors and having some kind of a mediation, some kind of a focus for that, which, is what a family altar is. It's a way of focusing your gratitude and thankfulness to these previous generations without whom you wouldn't be here, is another very simple and a very easy and a very powerful and effective thing that you can do in your lives and really change your lives from the better. And then, of course, come and work with me and do this work. And people do it many times, because every time we work, it gets deeper and deeper, because there are certain things that have to happen first. There are certain people that have to be acknowledged or seen or recognized, or issues that have to be seen. And then once that's addressed, then other things can emerge. And it's an ongoing process of removing veils of activities and going with that process. You can't control it. You have to work with what's revealed first, and then the work goes deeper and deeper and deeper into different areas of people's families and directions and lineages. And it is, of all the ways I've ever worked, one of the most powerful ways that I've ever experienced, and one that can transform people's lives dramatically and the lives of their family members